Well, this is a sad one, folks, but it potentially looks like any hope of more Last of Us content outside of the current TV show, which, well, let's say is controversial at best, is now gone, with Neil Druckmann recently saying, "I guess the only thing I would say is don't bet on there being any more The Last of Us, this could be it." Now, while some of you may be rejoicing at this news due to your deep-rooted hatred of the second game, I am not one of those people. I actually really liked the second game. The story didn't grip me quite as much as the first, but from a technical standpoint, I would call the game a masterpiece, improving in almost every area from the first. And so when I read this recent interview by Neil, my heart sinks, because he and Naughty Dog have now gotten every fan's hopes up twice. Firstly with the announcement of an online faction-style game, and then obvious hints of a part 3 in the Grounded 2 documentary, and then when we're least expecting it, we get slapped round the face with a completely off-the-cuff statement with no explanation behind it, while Neil just heads off to the Season 2 premiere, leaving us to soak up our tears. How does this happen? How does a developer like Naughty Dog, with all their experience and skill, make a decision to go back on 2 separate promises for new Last of Us games, and just have us sit there and take it, without any real explanation as to why? I find it very hard to believe that a developer like Naughty Dog would make statements about future games and then go back on them without more explanation. And so in this video, I want to talk about what else may have actually contributed to these projects being cancelled, and whether or not there is any hope for this franchise that we all love so much in the future. In 2013, The Last of Us debuted with an incredible single-player narrative that captivated players worldwide. However, it also introduced a multiplayer mode called Factions, which, despite being overshadowed by the main story, had a hardcore fanbase, with players, including myself, loving this kind of unique stealth-style gameplay. Factions offered a unique experience emphasizing stealth, resource management, and survival tactics, setting it apart from a lot of other multiplayer games at the time. As anticipation built for The Last of Us Part 2, fans eagerly awaited the return of Factions. Initially, Naughty Dog planned to include a multiplayer component in the sequel. However, as development progressed, the studio realized that the scope of the multiplayer mode had expanded beyond their initial expectations, and so in 2019, Naughty Dog announced that the multiplayer component would not be part of Part 2 at launch, stating, "You will eventually experience the fruits of our team's online ambition, but not as The Last of Us Part 2. This announcement hinted at a standalone multiplayer project in the works. Over the next few years, details about the standalone multiplayer game, often referred to as The Last of Us Online, remain scarce. In 2022, Naughty Dog released a piece of concept art during the Summer Game Fest, showcasing a post-apocalyptic San Francisco setting, which fueled excitement. However, concrete information about the game's mechanics, release date, or development progress was minimal. Behind the scenes, challenges were mounting. In May 2023, Bloomberg reported that Sony had brought in Bungie, known for its experience with live service games like Destiny, to evaluate this multiplayer project. Bungie's assessment raised concerns about the game's ability to sustain player engagement over time, a critical factor for live service titles. Following this evaluation, Naughty Dog announced an indefinite delay of the project, stating they needed more time to work on it. The situation culminated in December 2023 when Naughty Dog officially cancelled The Last of Us Online. In a blog post, the studio explained that the ambitious scope of the project would require dedicating all their resources to the post-launch support, which would significantly impact the development of future single-player games. They emphasized their commitment to single-player narrative experiences, saying, "We had 2 paths in front of us, becoming a solely live service game studio, or continue to focus on single-player narrative games that have defined Naughty Dog's heritage." And so just like that, all fans' hopes of a kind of multiplayer online world were shattered, and we were just left completely in the dark in terms of what was next for the Last of Us franchise. In the years following the release of The Last of Us Part 2, we have eagerly awaited for news about a potential third game. The ending of The Last of Us Part 2 is ambiguous to say the least. There are numerous unfinished storylines, unresolved character arcs, and narrative threads that remain dangling, and the weight of the series almost begs for closure in a trilogy format. At the end of the game, Ellie returns to the farmhouse she once shared with Dina and their child JJ, only to find it abandoned. Ellie's pursuit of revenge has cost her everything: her family, her health, and arguably her soul, yet she walks off into the unknown rather than ending her story in despair, leaving open the possibility for some kind of redemption arc. Her immunity, which was once central to the plot but largely sidelined in Part 2, remains a potential catalyst for a future storyline. If the Fireflies are indeed regrouping, as hinted to in the final chapters of the game, Ellie's cure may once again become central to humanity's fate. Whether she would willingly sacrifice herself, having already lost so much, is a question that I would personally love to have answered. Equally interesting is the unfinished journey of Abby and Lev. After Ellie spares Abby's life, Abby and Lev are seen traveling to the Firefly base on Catalina Island. Their fate is left uncertain. Abby's connection to the original Fireflies through her father could lead to a narrative where she helps resurrect the organization and have them try and find Ellie to try and create a cure once and for all. Lev also has a storyline that feels incomplete. His experiences with the Seraphite cult and his revenge for killing his sister is definitely something that could be explored more deeply. Another character who could also receive more attention in a future game is Tommy. Neil Druckmann has specifically mentioned in interviews that Tommy's story is one he'd be interested in exploring further, and in the Grounded Part 2 documentary he hints at a story that they had written for Tommy.
You know, we have written a story that takes place after Last of Us 2 that stars Tommy, and I hope one day we get to make it.
Tommy's final appearance in Part 2, crippled, angry, and estranged from his wife, raises questions. How does someone live with the guilt of encouraging violence that they can no longer carry out themselves? Could Tommy find redemption, or will he spiral further into bitterness? His knowledge, history with the Fireflies, and deep emotional scars make him a strong candidate for expanded exploration. Neil Druckmann has addressed the possibility of a third game on multiple occasions. In early 2023, he stated that the studio would only proceed with a sequel if they could develop a story that resonated as deeply as the previous entries. He emphasized that there was no obligation to continue the series unless a compelling narrative justified it. Later that year, in the documentary Grounded Part 2, Druckmann revealed that he had conceived a concept for a potential third game.
I don't have a story, but I do have that concept that to me is as exciting as 1, as exciting as 2, is its own thing, and yet has this through line for all 3.
However, he clarified that this was merely a concept without a developed story, indicating that the project was not in active development. Naughty Dog has since announced a new project titled Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, a sci-fi action-adventure game for the PS5. Unveiled at the Game Awards in December 2024, this title represents the studio's first new IP in over a decade. Druckmann described it as their wildest, most creative story yet, indicating a significant investment of resources and creative energy into the venture. Now, while I don't believe that the reasons we've been given for these cancellations have no truth to them, I do believe that there are also other factors that have almost certainly contributed to Naughty Dog's hesitancy to move forward with more Last of Us at this point in time. Most notably, we have to look at the backlash from the second game and the toll this took not only on Neil but the entire studio. In 2020, The Last of Us Part 2 was released to huge anticipation. However, the sequel quickly became one of the most polarizing titles in gaming history. The controversy began even before the game's official release, when major plot details were leaked online in April 2020. These leaks included the death of Joel at the hands of Abby.
I get this text from Evan, they just posted Joel's death. And my heart sinks. I can't even describe this feeling. It's just this like dread. It's almost like you just heard someone you care about died.
The premature exposure of such a crucial moment led to a wave of outrage among fans, many of whom formed negative opinions about the game without even playing it. Neil Druckmann has described the day of the leak as one of the worst days of his life. He recounted the experience of watching the leaked footage spread online, the ensuing panic, and the realization that the game's most impactful moments had been revealed without context. This not only undermined the narrative experience, but also subjected the development team to intense scrutiny and criticism. The backlash only got stronger upon the game's release. Many players were upset by the narrative choices, particularly the decision to have the players control Abby for a significant portion of the game. The game was review bombed on platforms like Metacritic, where user scores plummeted due to coordinated negative reviews. Druckmann and members of the cast, particularly Laura Bailey, who voiced Abby, received death threats and hate messages. Druckmann expressed deep concern for the well-being of his team, stating that he felt terrible and depressed over the harassment they endured. He apologized to Troy Baker, the voice of Joel, fearing that he'd let him down, but Troy and Bailey and the rest of the team, despite the backlash, stood by the game's narrative choices. This emotional toll was significant. Druckmann spoke about the difficulty of maintaining morale among the team during this period, as they grappled with negative reception and personal attacks. He acknowledged that while the team believed in the story they told, the intensity of the backlash was unexpected and disheartening. I believe that this experience has almost certainly contributed to this cautious approach regarding the development of a potential third installment. To put yourself and your entire team through an experience like that again is a huge gamble, and no matter what direction they decide to go in, it will almost certainly be met with a certain level of criticism again. For Druckmann and his team, the experience underscored the importance of resilience and the need to support one another in the face of adversity. Another big reason to why this might be the end of The Last of Us is the sheer amount of time, effort, and pressure it takes to make a game of this quality. Naughty Dog has long been at the center of controversy surrounding the gaming industry's pervasive crunch culture, a pattern of extreme overtime, mental exhaustion, and unsustainable work practices, particularly in the final months leading up to a game's release. During the development of The Last of Us Part 2, multiple reports emerged detailing how the studio's relentless pursuit of perfection came at a steep cost to its developers. Former employees described an environment where crunch wasn't officially mandated, but the internal culture made it feel expected. Many developers reportedly experienced anxiety, burnout, and depression during the game's extended development, and while the final product was widely praised, the human cost behind its creation cast a long shadow. Neil Druckmann has been both lauded and criticized in this context. As a visionary, he's driven by storytelling, ambition, and a desire to push the medium forward, but that same passion has also been cited as a contributing factor to the work intensity at the studio. While Druckmann has acknowledged the toll the process takes and has publicly expressed interest in evolving the studio's approach to development, some critics argue that leadership has not done enough to truly change the studio's demanding work culture. This backdrop and strain of controversy adds a layer of complexity to Naughty Dog's future, particularly when it comes to whether they would commit to another Last of Us entry. The pressure to meet sky-high expectations, both from the players and the industry, would be immense. Following the massive success of the HBO adaptation and the still resonant cultural impact of the games, any continuation would be under a huge microscope. Internally, this could reignite the same tensions around deadlines, scope, and crunch that plagued the first two games. In contrast, developing a new IP like Intergalactic offers the studio a fresh canvas. Without the burden of a pre-existing universe or weight of sequels, there's more creative freedom, fewer fan expectations to manage, and potentially a more flexible production schedule. That freedom might allow Naughty Dog to experiment not just creatively, but structurally, possibly adapting healthier workflows, new production pipelines, and better safeguards against burnout. As the industry continues to scrutinize its labor practices, and as public sentiment shifts towards sustainable game development, how Naughty Dog chooses to proceed, whether returning to The Last of Us or pivoting to more new titles, will be a revealing test of what lessons have truly been learned. Neil Druckmann's recent remarks are very strange, mainly because of how starkly they contrast with his previous comments in the Grounded 2 documentary and other interviews. The apparent finality of his statement feels at odds with the carefully laid narrative groundwork in The Last of Us Part 2, and even Naughty Dog's own storytelling patterns. For many fans and industry observers, it doesn't quite add up. So why the mixed messaging? There are several reasons to believe that Druckmann's recent comments might be more misdirection than confirmation of a franchise ending. First off, secrecy is part of Naughty Dog's DNA. The studio is notorious for keeping projects under wraps until they're close to being revealed. Publicly denying development while working in secret isn't unheard of in the industry, especially when marketing and narrative impact are carefully choreographed. After the original game's massive success in 2013, the question of a sequel loomed large. Fans speculated, media asked, and yet for years Druckmann and Naughty Dog remained evasive. In a 2014 Reddit AMA, Druckmann said, "We're brainstorming more The Last of Us, but we're also brainstorming new ideas." A year later, in a 2015 interview with official PlayStation magazine, he said, "We were brainstorming ideas for The Last of Us Part 2 with different characters and ideas, but all of a sudden Uncharted 4 kind of jumped to the forefront." He added that a sequel would only happen if we came up with a story that's as emotionally engaging as the first one. This kind of hedging, acknowledging possibilities without confirming intent, is typical of Naughty Dog's approach. Yet in December 2016, the studio did reveal The Last of Us Part 2 was already in development and had been for over a year. In hindsight, it's clear that while Druckmann and his team publicly downplayed the idea of a sequel, they were actively working on one. The statements weren't false, but they were strategically cautious. The same pattern can be seen in the Uncharted franchise. After Uncharted 3 wrapped up Nathan Drake's story arc in 2011, Naughty Dog strongly implied that the series had reached a natural endpoint. Druckmann and his fellow co-director Bruce Stanley emphasized that any continuation would have to feel essential. As late as 2013, Naughty Dog's community strategist Arnie Meyer told IGN, "We don't know what's going to happen with Uncharted. We're not making any promises." Despite these comments, Uncharted 4 was officially announced in 2013 and released in 2016, again after years of development that were likely underway during these very interviews. And even after Uncharted 4 was pitched as the end of Nathan Drake's story, Naughty Dog went on to release The Lost Legacy, a full standalone game featuring Chloe Fraser and Nadine Ross. This was despite previous public messaging that the franchise might be finished or at least going dormant. We also hear this in the Grounded Part 2 documentary.
Naughty Dog had always made one game, and as soon as it finishes one game, it works on another. When I started on Uncharted 3, we were starting to experiment then with trying to do 2 teams.
The fact that Naughty Dog clearly broke into 2 separate teams for The Last of Us Part 2 means that there could very well be easily one team focusing on intergalactic, a more action-style game like Uncharted, and another team focusing on something completely different. These examples establish a clear pattern. Naughty Dog and Druckmann specifically have a history of keeping their cards close to their chest, whether it's a marketing strategy, a way to manage creative pressure, or simply a desire to protect the integrity of storytelling. The studio's public statements often underplay what's happening behind the scenes. There are also very practical and commercial reasons as to why a third game makes sense. With the HBO show breathing new life into the franchise and expanding its audience to non-gamers, the appetite for more is stronger than ever. Sony has every incentive to greenlight a third installment. From a business standpoint, not making Part 3 would be leaving significant money and legacy on the table. But perhaps what's most compelling is what Part 2 leaves unresolved. Ellie's story does not end with closure. She is alive, alone, and still immune, walking away from everything she once held dear. I find it really hard to believe that a story as loved as this will not end with some kind of closure. And so despite everything we have heard, if I had to take a guess and went with my heart, I would say that there is still a final chapter still to be told in this franchise. I think that Naughty Dog will have learned from their mistakes around things like the leak, the anger caused by the misdirection in the marketing, and I just don't believe that Neil and the rest of the team at Naughty Dog don't want to give closure to characters who have lost so much and are loved by so many. This is by far one of the greatest franchises in gaming, and it deserves a proper send-off, and not in the form of a TV show, which by no means do I think is terrible, but it doesn't hold a candle to the games. And so to people out there dying for a Last of Us Part 3, don't lose hope. While I don't think we'll hear anything about it super soon, as Naughty Dog will want the community focus to be on intergalactic, I believe that we haven't heard the last of The Last of Us. Remember this, The Last of Us Part 1 came out at the very end of the PlayStation 3, The Last of Us Part 2 came out at the very end of the PlayStation 4, maybe, just maybe, The Last of Us Part 3 will be one of the last games to send off the PlayStation 5 era before we move into the next generation. And so until we hear more, keep the faith, and if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe, as it is a huge help. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.
So it does feel like there's probably one more chapter to the story.